The Constitution of the State of Florida, as revised in 1968. So you see that, 1968 edition. This was prior to the International Covenants of 1976. Basic rights in the Florida Constitution, 1968. All natural persons, so what they're trying to define there is men and women, human beings. This was prior to 1976. All natural persons, female and male alike, are equal before the law and have inalienable rights, among which are the right to enjoy and defend life and liberty, to pursue happiness, to be rewarded for industry, and to acquire, possess, and protect property. The Constitution of the State of Vermont. This was again made prior to 1976. That all persons are born equally free and independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending of life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. The Constitution of Russia, Article 17, subsection 2. Fundamental human rights and freedoms are inalienable, and shall be enjoyed by everyone since the day of birth. I've been speaking about how international law controls domestic law. And I've been speaking about that because most people don't understand how the laws are dominating them or controlling them. We know that there's a legal structure all around us, but we don't understand it. Now, the international covenants flow into the American Constitution through something called the Supremacy Act, the Supremacy Clause. For Russia and Canada, the international covenants were brought forth directly through the Constitution. In Russia, it was 1993 that they did this. In Canada, it was 1982. Now, the constitutions are the supreme law of the land. It's the supreme law for Canada, Russia, and America. And further to this, we learned that any law, enactment, or regulation that goes against the supreme law, the Constitution, it's of no force or effect against us. We have the rights as individual to declare that your enactment or regulation, it's of no force or effect against me because it goes against my constitutional rights. Now, what exactly did the international covenants bring in to our countries? What rights, what freedoms did this covenant bring into our constitutions? We know for sure now that the International Covenant has been given force of law. It's considered the supreme law in the land, within Canada, within Russia, and within America. Now, what rights did it bring forth for us? In 1976, the International Covenants were created and signed upon by many nations of this world. Now, this created a legal obligation towards natural inalienable rights, towards common law rights, towards what you would call fundamental rights and freedoms. Whoever signed upon this covenant now had a legal obligation to respect these rights. Now, as I mentioned the other day, these covenants didn't produce these rights. It wasn't like these rights started with these covenants. These rights, these inalienable rights, had been recognized in law for many, many generations. You only need to look to your own constitutions in America to see this fact. When you look at the Florida Constitution of 1968, or you look at the Vermont Constitution of 1975, which actually stems back to the 1800s. In the Florida Constitution, Article 1, subsection 2, and the Vermont Constitution, Article 1, it talks about inalienable rights. It talks about natural rights. And it says these rights are expressed through life, property, and liberty, and the right to defend this property. So even prior to the international covenants, the governments were aware that we had inalienable, natural, common law rights that were in operation. The difference was that we, as individuals who had these rights, we were expected to surrender these rights in order for the public good. And that's what law declared. Law said, yes, you have these rights, but you must surrender them in order for the public good. However, now 1976 comes along, and the covenant says no. now public order is under fundamental rights and freedoms. So don't get it in your mind that the covenants started these rights. They didn't. As I shared with you in the last video, it's just an expression of what had developed over many, many generations of interaction of mankind. And you can see this very clearly in your own constitutions in America. 1968, the Florida Constitution, and 1975. These constitutions were already expressing these rights that were now going to be guaranteed in the international covenants. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2, Subsection 2. It states, where not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 5. Nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. When you look into the Constitution of Russia, Article 17.2 talks about the fact that human rights are inalienable. Fundamental rights and freedoms are inalienable. They're natural, we're born with them. Now, in Article 2.2 of the International Covenant, it said to Russia, to America, and to Canada that you guys, you domestic party now, you must give effect to these rights and freedoms. All these rights and freedoms that are coming out of the covenant, you are now under obligation to give effect to these rights. And the Article of Law was more specific. It said you have to give effect to these rights through your Constitution or through other measures, other means. And we see, again I'll restate it, that they did give effect to these rights in America through the Supremacy Clause, brings in the International Covenant, places the liability upon the executive powers of the government. Through Canada and Russia, it was through the Constitution Act directly, the majority of the rights. Now, in Canada and in America, you have, in Canada it's provinces, in America it would be states. Okay, you have different states, 50 states. You have governors of these states in America. These governors are considered the executive powers of your state party. You have the President of America, who's the head of the executive powers, and then you have the governors of your states, who are also considered executive powers. These are the ones who have the accountability towards the covenant and towards your fundamental rights and freedoms. Maybe not the individual who's sitting there in the office, because that changes, but the office itself has the duty and responsibility to protect your fundamental rights and freedoms. So the governor in the states, for example, I've already taught about Canada, but I'll teach about both. The governor in the states, he has to sign off on these laws and all these regulations. He must put his John Hancock from the office, the stamp of approval on it. So he's supposed to now go through the laws, go through the regulations, and make sure that whatever law they're creating is not going against your fundamental rights and freedoms that they are legally obligated to respect because what the covenant has placed upon them. And if the law or regulation is correct, then he signs off on it and it should become law if it doesn't breach your fundamental rights and freedoms. But they all breach your fundamental rights and freedoms. But that's the process. So if this guy is signing laws into operation that is going against your covenant rights, you can go against him and say, as executive power, you and your legislators do not have the right to be creating laws that remove my fundamental rights and freedoms. In Canada, it's the same thing. The Queen is the one who signs off on regulations or enactments. We get a statement within our laws that says the Queen has given it royal assent. But because she's not in operation here in Canada, she has transferred those powers to the Governor General. It's actually the Governor General who signs off on them. The Governor General who gives it royal assent. So again, his office would be accountable for these bills, for these regulations. And if they're passing bills, regulations that go against our fundamental rights and freedoms that are found in our constitutions, that are found through the international covenants, then they are accountable and they can be held accountable. We have the executive powers. In America, it's the president and the governors. In Canada, it's the Queen who transfers her powers to the Governor General. In Russia, it's considered the President and the Prime Minister who hold the executive powers. Primarily is the President. Now, within each country, these executive powers have legislators who work for them, and these legislators are the ones who create laws, domestic laws, enactments and regulations. Now, these legislators, once they create the laws, these executive powers sign off on them, boop boop, and they become force of law in the land. However, the legislators who are making these laws and the executive powers who are signing off on these laws all have accountability to the Constitution Act of the country and by default to the rights and freedoms found in the international covenants. And if these guys here, these legislators, create laws that go against the Constitution or the covenants, they're of no force or effect against us. And again, if these guys here sign off on laws that go against the rights and freedoms that are in the Constitution, or that go against the rights and freedoms that are enumerated in the covenants, then they are of no force or effect against us. Because remember, the Constitution and the covenants are the supreme law. And these laws that they are making up here are secondary to the supreme law. And when you catch them trying to remove your fundamental right and freedom, you can say no. Prior to this, to the covenants, inalienable rights, what they would call inalienable rights, common law rights, were subjected to public law. Were subjected to these laws. Legislators could make laws. It was gung-ho time. Public, you have to submit. Got no choice, no say. We can make laws, we can do what we want. All right, party time. Now, 1976 comes along. Inalienable rights, fundamental rights and freedoms are protected for the individual. No longer now is public law the primary ruling power. It's subjected to fundamental rights and freedoms. Party's over. They're not happy. We want to continue to party. Oh well. So now, our fundamental rights and freedoms, the rights that are in the covenant, that are expressed in the covenant, brought through the Constitution, are primary. And if we catch the legislators making laws that are contrary or removing our fundamental rights and freedoms, we can say no. Let's look at one right, the right to property. Since a lot of people talk about it, and I read a lot about things on the internet, how people are saying you can do this to get your property back, you can do this to own your property in freehold and free title, and a whole bunch of garbage is going out there, and it seems a lot of people are interested in property rights. So, okay, we all have inalienable natural rights. When you look at it, if you read that in a dictionary, whether it's Black Laws, Valentine's, or whatever it may be, and as we saw in 1968 and 1965 in the constitutions, when it talks about natural rights or inalienable rights, they always use examples. And they seem to always use the example of life, liberty, and property. So they say inalienable rights, and then they mention life, liberty, and property. There's more to that than just those three, but we're going to look at property. Okay, so the covenant grants us as individual men and women the right to freedom of association. We can associate with who we want to, and we cannot be forced into an association with anybody, any party. Now, we are allowed to hold our property, the covenant says, alone or in association with others. That's a right we have. We can hold our property alone or in association. We have the right in the covenant to be recognized as a person before the law, and no one can place us into servitude. Those are the three rights that would attach concerning property. Now, when we look at property, let's look at a home, for example. Now, I'm not talking about a home that is mortgaged. If the home is mortgaged and you owe a mortgage to that, there's a different story on that. The note, the promissory note that you're paying off, has already been paid. And according to their own terms and conditions of the banks, especially if you read here in Canada, they took the right to set off that note, and they already set off the liability. Otherwise, there's no way the bank can be declaring a $5 or $6 billion profit here in Canada. When you look on the books, they got over, it's $7 trillion on loan, but yet they're declaring a $5 or $6 billion profit. It's because you're setting off all those liabilities. But nevertheless, that's a story for another day. Property. So when you look at property, if you own it and you don't have a mortgage on it, it's paid off, and now there's only one title to it. That would be at the city, your local municipality, who's ever issuing that tax bill. So as a man, we have a right, an inalienable right, to own property alone. End of story. Okay? The governments don't like it. Huff and puff all you want. Why? Because it's a source of revenue for them. That's why. But it's an inalienable right that a man has, and it's a right to have property, to own it alone, and to defend that property. Now what they do is they treat you as a citizen. Remember we talked about how you can enter into recognition as that citizen through that oath. You take an obligation and you say, I'm going to take upon me the duties and responsibilities to obey the laws of the land. Okay? So they put you into the role of citizen, which is that person, that artificial person in law. So here, while you're standing as a man, you have a right. You have a right to recognition as a person in law. And that would be Article 16 of the International Covenants. It grants you the right. They automatically place you into the person, into that position of citizen. Okay? And they strip you out of your designation of man or woman. Now, they attach to your citizen a right of ownership. Now, I didn't say your citizen owns it. I said they attach a right of ownership. And it's only certain powers that attach with this right. For example, okay, I don't know exactly how it works in America, but there's going to be a similar operation of law, and same thing in Russia. I'll give you the example here in Canada. If you own a house, if you own property, the local municipality where you live will send you a tax bill, and you'll have to pay that tax bill annually. If you don't pay that bill after several years, probably 3 years, they will come, they will try and seize your property, they will actually seize it, they will put it up for auction, and they will sell off your property. Even though you may not own a mortgage to the property anymore, even though you may have paid it off and you think it belongs to you, the city actually has superior rights to that property. So you could have a property that's worth $500,000 and you haven't paid your tax bill for 3 years, and your tax bill is only $10,000. They'll come in, they'll seize your home, and they'll sell it off. And you'll lose $500,000 of property for a $10,000 bill. That's the operation of law that they can use against you. Now, they, as the municipality, are operating as administrators for the public good. That's what they claim. So, for example, if you have your property and you're building up a fence that's too high, they'll come by and say, we have a bylaw, we have a regulation, we have an act that says you can only build your fence 6 foot high. You can't go over 8 foot high. You can't build it at 8 foot. Sorry, you have to only build it at 6 foot high. We created that law, and it's for the public good. Or, for example, you can have a horse, and I know it's a funny story, but you can have a horse on your front lawn, and then the city will come by and say, sorry, there's a rule, you cannot have a horse on your front lawn. It has to be, and I agree with some of those rules because an animal should be gone out. But what I'm trying to say is that they have a whole bunch of rules and regulations, bylaws, where they control what you can and cannot do with your property. If you want to make it bigger, you got to call them and ask them for a license. You got to pay for fees, and then they grant you the right to make your property bigger. So even though you live there and you have certain rights to your property, the rights that you have as the citizen are inferior to the rights that the city holds over you. Because the city can dispose of your property if you don't pay the bill, and the city can stop you from taking actions on your own property that breach their bylaw, if you stay and operate from the position of the citizen or person. As the man, you own your property outright. It's an inalienable right that we have, and the covenants recognize it. Therefore, it's a constitutional right that flows through the Constitution and flows through the covenant. And when you remain in your position and designation of human being, man or woman, then you own that property outright. And when the administrators or the municipality tries to come by and say you can't do such and such, or you owe us such and such, you say, excuse me, where are you drawing that duty from? You claim that I owe you $5,000. You claim that I cannot make my room bigger. Where are you telling me I can't do that? Did you just wake up this morning and all of a sudden decide that and come and bother me? He's going to say, no, 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 no. According to our enactments and regulations, you can't do such and such actions. Well, hang on a second. These enactments and regulations that are saying I cannot do such and such actions, they are actually stripping me of my fundamental right and freedom. Because my fundamental right and freedom says I don't have to have my property in association with you guys. Therefore, I don't have to have you administrate my property. You are coming and trying to administrate my property because you are holding my property in association with you. You're breaching my fundamental right and freedom right there. If you didn't think that you had the ability to hold my property in association with you, you'd never come walking to me and tell me I have a duty or an obligation to your enactments or regulations. You see, as man, as a woman, I own my property alone. And I have no accountability and no association to you. Therefore, I don't have any accountability or association to the enactment or regulation. And most of the enactments or regulations, when you read them and study them, they have nothing to do with common law. It's not about harming somebody or taking from someone or doing damage to someone. It's all about regulating and controlling to make a material profit. Everything you want to do is a license, everything you want to do is a permit. But that's how it plays out with your property rights. When you read the Criminal Code of Canada, it talks about the inhabitants. When it talks about what a municipality is, it talks about the inhabitants. They're incorporated and they're entitled to hold their property collectively for a public purpose. And they use the word entitled. So if you're living in the town of Montreal, just use Canada for an example. Most people know Montreal or Toronto. If you're living in the town there, the municipality, the city is claiming that they are holding your property in association together, and you gave them the right. It was an entitlement, you could do it, and they're automatically saying you did it. Therefore, we have the right to administrate your property. But if you stand up and stand on your fundamental rights and freedoms and say, no, hang on, I don't have to surrender my property to you guys, I don't have to be taxed, and I don't have to be governed in this way. Now, if you're using services such as garbage services, I think you should then willfully pay for those services or stop using those services. If you're getting water, no, I don't think you need to pay for water. That's an infrastructure. That's a government responsibility. Under the covenants, they have to provide for that. But even sanitary services, when you look at it, it would fall under the covenants. So your property, your private property as a citizen now, it's been appropriated to a public purpose. It's being held in association with your local government, your local municipality, your local city, and they are acting as administrators for this property. And they claim the color of law, they claim the reason why they can do this to you and me, or whoever's watching this video and listening and understanding, hopefully, is for the public good. That's the reason. Mr. Enforcer, go do it, it's for the public good. I'm doing all this, it's for the public good. Remember what we've talked about listening to this video. Man can hold their property alone. Don't have to hold it in association, don't have to take recognition as a person, don't have to be in servitude. It's a fundamental right and freedom. And now, since 1976, our fundamental rights and freedoms overrides their public good. That's why when they present it in their own laws, they present it as a choice, as an option. Because the legislators, the ones who are making those laws, they know. And sometimes when they're creating the laws, they're respecting them. And a lot of times, they're not. So your property now, as an individual man or a woman, you can claim to have ownership to that property. Tell the state party, the executive powers, remove it from association with me. Remove it from association with you guys, off the roll, off the books. You're not administrators to my property.